Creating a donut in every version of Blender. It's a pretty simple idea, but I was kind of struggling to create this video for it. Originally, I wanted to start with the earliest version first, but the more I worked on it, the more I uncovered this surprising underlying story of Blender as a program that you can only really appreciate when we start from where we are today. Blender 4.0 released on November the 14th, 2023. And with that, we also got an updated version of the donut tutorial. I don't think we need the first beginner tutorial because I think it's more explaining the interface and stuff. I know that much, so we can probably skip that. And we get an ad. Nice. The basic modeling tools haven't changed that much in the last 4 years since I've started using Blender, and that's probably because they're already really good. Fun fact, this was the first donut I've ever created. I've never done the donut tutorial myself before, so I hope you like this one. Compared to 3.0, creating a donut is pretty much the same, but a few of the existing features got improved. One thing that they have added is actually the search function here in the add section. If you want to add a life that doesn't exist in Blender, unfortunately, you have to find that yourself. But what exists is, for example, a torus. If we go to the modifier, this has also changed. You can just go in here and say, hey, I want to add a modifier. I'm looking for subdivision surface. There you go. The material principal BSDF looks different. From what I've seen, I think the principal BSDF is just more effective now or more efficient and is separated into these things, probably just to make it maybe easier to know which settings kind of are supposed to be used together. I'm not sure if I like the new principal BSDF just yet, but maybe I'll just have to get used to the new layout. The most exciting feature, for me at least, is probably the addition of node tools. You can basically use geometry nodes to create your own functions and automate whatever you want to automate. And the great thing is you can use these in edit mode and sculpt mode. There are of course a ton more improvements and changes, but for me at least this update feels more like a quality of life update to make walking in Blender just a lot quicker. It took what 3.0 brought and made it even better. Compared to 4.0, 3.0 is a monumental release for reasons we'll get into in a bit. So how do you actually model a donut in Blender?
Welcome to the wonderful world of 3D.
Creating a donut is pretty much the same as how most people know it. But this is the first big release that added geometry nodes. So instead of having to place each sprinkle on the donut manually or using particles, you can randomly sprinkle them with just a few nodes. How does that work again? Whoa. Okay, I've used that before. Why is it not like that? Well, if you know what you're doing. And you can not only reuse this sprinkle system, but also turn it into an asset for the brand new asset browser. A whole new way to pull assets from other blend files that make the process a lot more efficient and intuitive. And for anyone watching that started using Blender with 4.0 or later, this is what the principal BSDF looked like before. Now the last decision to make for your donut is whether you want to render it in cycles or in Eevee. Both have been added in version 3.0. Let me explain. In between every full version release, there are a bunch of smaller updates that improve new and old features or add entirely new ones, which then get finalized for a new full version release. And since there are so many updates that individually change only a few things here and there, I decided to only create a donut for every full version, and every update that happened after the last version is part of the next one. Version 4.0 released 2 years after 3.0. The time between 3.0 and 2.0 is a bit longer. Here are some of the things that have been added since 2.0. Eevee, cycles, a UI redesign, physics simulations, shape keys, sculpting, subsurface gathering, the grease pencil, dynamic paint, camera tracking, volumetrics, another UI redesign, VR support, render denoising, the compositor, motion blur, the UV editor, a search function, the outliner modifiers, a total recoding of the entire software, and most importantly, Suzanne. Basically, almost everything you now know and use in Blender over a time span of 21 years. So, what did Blender version 2.0 actually look like? Yeah. How does this work? Aha. Okay, so rotating is still on middle mouse button, that's good to know. Fun fact, when this released in the year 2000, I was 1 year old. Hello? It doesn't go away. Hello. That's not good. What is this? Render this view. Okay, let's see what happens. Nothing. Currently the frame size is 320 by 256. Not necessarily what I would choose, but I guess maybe back then it was that was quite a lot. First of all, I want to increase this. If I click, it increases by 1. Shift A should be adding. Aha. You can also... Oh, interesting. So we have more than just... We have everything on A. Shift A. Edit buttons. What is this? World button. Oh, that's weight pinning. What is that? Radiosity buttons. Whatever that is. At first, I tried to figure out how to do, well, anything by myself. A gower. There are so many words that I've never seen before. But that didn't really work out so well. Maybe I should press more buttons. Control A, apply size rotation, okay. Shift S, snapping. Shift D. Luckily, I actually found a Blender manual for 2.0 from back in the day. Aha, that looks better. We even have chapters, okay. Is there like a hotkey section? Oops window, okay. We have an oops window. What is that? That is the oops window, okay. Q key, this key closes Blender, okay. So if you only press Q, oh, that's, I thought I pressed D, okay. So what could you actually do in 2.0? Modeling. You could extrude, scale, and move things around. It even has proportional editing. You also had to select everything with right click. Left click only really existed to place the 3D cursor in your scene. I don't really understand why you need one of the mouse buttons to do that, but it for sure was pretty frustrating. Oh my god, again. But even though the modeling tools were pretty limited, you still had everything you need to create a simple donut. Except for maybe the ability to add edge loops, that would have been pretty helpful. Also, the modifiers didn't exist yet, so the icing on the donut will just be a single flat layer of faces. Oh, and best of all, if you made a mistake and you want to undo it, well, too bad, there is no way to undo. The only thing you can do is reset it back to the point where you entered edit mode. One thing that did already exist though is a very simple shading editor. You could even use textures back in the day. And with a few simple lines and a background, I was actually able to render my donut in a version of Blender from 23 years ago. Now let's go back 5 more years to the earliest version of Blender that exists, version 1.0. This is Blender 1.0. I don't even think Windows existed back then. This is an old operating system from back in the day called Irix, and the only way you can really run it today is with an emulator. Shout out to Greg who helped me with setting all this up properly. I probably could have never done it without his help. If you want to use Blender yourself, he has a tutorial about it. Make sure to download the same MAME version, which is the emulator that you need to use. Download the same version that he downloaded, because otherwise, for me at least, it didn't work with a newer version. Just as a quick heads up. Compared to version 2.0, it wasn't actually that different. Some features like proportional editing are gone, but you still have enough to create a nice donut. Part of the 1.0 files is actually a manual for version 1.0 as well. This is what the first Blender manual looked like. Very minimal, but you can see also the old Blender logo, what it was before the orange and blue thingy. I actually learned about, what this is actually supposed to be, and it is basically supposed to be an eye. I think the idea was sort of like a combination of like an eye and a hand, because like hand-eye coordination, I think it was like sort of the thought process. While creating this last donut, I noticed how many features we still use today are already in this version. A lot of hotkeys, for example, are still the same, like Shift A to add an object, or Shift S to snap an object or the 3D cursor to something. Even the way you can create your own layout with multiple subdivisions in a single window has already been there since the beginning. Ton Roosendaal, the creator of Blender, even describes this in a blog post 10 years ago. Every 2D or 3D graphics program back in the day was opening a ton of small windows, which he wanted to do differently for Blender. And that idea from 30 years ago is still how we work today. I also looked into the history of Blender outside of the program, and something that shocked me was that Blender almost died in 2002. Back then, Ton received a ton of money from investors to develop Blender, but unfortunately his company expanded a little too far, so the investors cancelled the Blender project altogether. But because Ton didn't want Blender to just die a silent death unavailable to anyone, he struck a deal. If he can crowdfund 100,000 euros, he could buy the rights to Blender and make it publicly available to everyone. It only took 7 weeks to collect the amount required, and the free Blender campaign was a success. Ton's vision from the beginning to create a 3D program that would enable anyone to create whatever they want in one program for free could live on, and he put Blender on the internet. He didn't have any more money to continue developing it, but at least now it stands as a monument for what he was able to achieve, and the fans could still enjoy it. But this is where the development of Blender really began. After a while, Ton noticed how the community was starting to fix and improve more and more aspects themselves. The people weren't just going to let Blender die like that, and soon after, Ton decided he wasn't going to let that happen either. With the help from the community through donations to the Blender Foundation, the development continued and is still going on to this day, 30 years after it initially began. I thought the story had 2 pretty good lessons. A project can seem way too big to handle, but as long as you keep taking small steps forward, over time these steps add up to big leaps. And sooner than later, that crazy idea you had back then has become a reality. A lot of things that seem impossible can be done. All it takes is time, a little bit of luck, and a clear vision to guide the way.
You being able to create a complete universe inside of a computer. 3D is magic, and by making Blender, I would enable myself and later on everyone to experience that magic idea of 3D creation, making games, make movies, make visual effects.